right, everyone. Hey, this is Bill Hanks. I'm here with Dr. Thomas, Brent Dorval, and James White, and we are talking about the food inflammation test that they are offering. We got to know KBMO through the COVID outbreak, and we started offering their antibodies test, I think, back in April. And we'd heard about them doing this. They're one of the first people to get it out there. And then through this, we learned a lot about some of the other products that they're offering. And, at our place, we're all about optimization. And I would say, 9 out of 10 clients that come in the door for our services, they're always wanting to reduce inflammation. I mean, it's one of the main causes of all of the conditions out there, and just so important. And you guys, very, very, very nice to have. You have a food inflammation test, and that food inflammation test can help us look at the foods that we're eating in our diet and use those foods to identify sources that aren't benefiting our system. And, we look at gut health, and gut health is one of the most important things that we can have for our immune system. And so we'll just kind of dig into this food inflammation test and talk about it, and kind of come up with, your science behind it. I, just want to learn about it with everybody else, and tell us, what differentiates you from everything else. I've taken some food sensitivity testing, and I didn't have much results with that. So I'm really interested in how food inflammation testing is different for that. And so I got some slides here. I'll go ahead and pull them up, and we'll go ahead and I'll let you guys take it, whoever wants to go first, and just kind of share what you want to talk about. So.
Well, maybe right before we get started, I too just want to echo what Bill said, that I've been eating better advice kind of guy for more than 20 years. And I've not at all been happy with the testing for food sensitivities to date. So that's why I'm very excited to be educated today, because I'm hoping this is going to make some impact, because there's lots of insults that affect our body. Food is one of the major ones. And if this can help us differentiate those that are causing insults to our body versus those that we're doing well, that can make an impact in anybody's life. So teach us.
Let me just do a quick introduction of Brent. He's our Chief Scientific Officer. His significant claim to fame was he invented the first rapid HIV diagnostic, and so you'll see as we go through this presentation his kind of what I would describe as infectious disease DNA throughout the company, in terms of from examples of the fact we run 15 standards of controls per patient, the fact that we're running 3 ELISA plates versus a single one like some of our competition. So again, I think that gives us a real advantage in terms of to the kind of eloquent points that you guys made about some of the limitations on these tests historically. Are they reproducible? Are they accurate? Certainly, if you've got the brains behind your test having an infectious disease background, then again that approach of being belt and braces and making sure it's highly accurate, I think gives us a real differential between some of the other tests before some of the kind of, I think, key technological benefits that Brent kind of came up with to invent the test as well. So Bill, do you want to move on to the next slide, and I'll pass over to Brent, and he can kind of go through the testing and some of the technology that we've got here as well. Brent, over to you.
Yeah, great. It's great to be speaking to everybody again. As James mentioned, when we first developed this test, the focus was really on quality and really developing a good manufacturing process that was solid, reproducible, and that was traceable right from cradle to grave. So we've got a good documentation regulatory system that accompanies this. So back to the subject at hand, which is food sensitivities. We're going to talk about those, a little bit of gut inflammation and permeability, and I can give you an overview of food sensitivities, the company, and also some new products. So we'll just get a few definitions out of the way. I think as everybody is aware, most everybody, food allergy. Allergy is mediated by IgE, and it's a type 1 hypersensitivity, and it's immediate. So that's the one where if you get stung by a bee or exposed to something like that, it comes on rapidly. You get airway constriction generally, and you need epinephrine, and very often that will be a lifesaver. We're going to deal with the FIT test, which is food sensitivity. And that is an immunologic reaction to food. Could be IgA, could be IgG. We're going to deal with mostly the IgG because that's what the basis of the test is. And then the third category is food intolerance. That's non-immunologic, and a good one is lactose intolerance. You have an enzyme deficiency, so you cannot tolerate lactose, the sugar lactose. Okay, so when would a doctor use this test? Obviously, if the patient doesn't feel well, but there are a host of things that really go hand in hand with a decision to use this test: autoimmune, thyroid, arthritis, brain fog, fatigue for sure, digestive, gut issues, and skin problems, which are probably a triad of the most common problems and symptoms that you see in a patient. Fibroids, of course, endometriosis, breast cancer, or other cancers. And a common thread when you look at all of these various symptoms is the cornerstone is inflammation. You produce an antibody, ultimately an immune complex ensues, you activate complement, and you generate inflammation, which really causes many of these symptoms. In the next slide. The immune complex issues and inflammation can be associated with foods are the underlying problem, as I mentioned, for most all these conditions seen on a daily basis. Again, once complement is kicked off, that cascade just keeps on going. It generates some mediators and inflammatory molecules that we'll talk about. This is just a simple pictogram of the gut mucosa, and on the left-hand side, you can see abnormal cells. On the right-hand side, the tight junctions are intact. So what happens, just in a nutshell, is foods enter the gut. They're broken down into a variety of immunomodulatory peptides or mediators. And if you have leaky gut or inflammation, they manage to get through the gut wall. So and through the lamina propria. And when they do that, they enter the bloodstream and also the lymph nodes, or the Peyer's patches that are located in the gut. And from there, the rest, it just kicks off a cascade of events where you have T and B cells ultimately produce IgM, then IgG antibody. And then, as you can see, way to the right-hand side, once you form immune complexes, they can either activate complement in the vicinity of a tissue and cause inflammation, mainly through two molecules, C3A and C5A. We can talk a little bit about those later on. Very, very potent stimulators of inflammation. You get complement activation, inflammation, and the symptoms then are associated with a variety of diseases. It's especially severe sometimes when these immune complexes actually lodge in the tissue. And so if a food antigen lodged in the tissue and an antibody bound to it, you get an in situ immune complex, and you can get lysis of your own cells. And that's what happens in many kidney-related diseases. And the next slide. So I think people are curious about what is the difference between the KBMO FIT test and all other IgG-only tests. The other tests are depicted on the left-hand side. What happens is we coat an ELISA plate with food antigens, additives, or microbial products. And what happens is within that ELISA well, those are the red dots. That's a food antigen. We then add the human serum. and an antibody binds to that food antigen. And in a conventional test, you just add a detection reagent, an anti-human antibody, and what they do is they get one signal from the IgG alone, but they do not measure complement. Now, complement may be bound, as you can see. That's the little green flag that's on the antibody, but they don't detect it. So what we figured out early on is, there's another signal there we can pick up that indicates inflammation. So when immune complexes activate complement, C3b is deposited. That's just a molecule that binds, and it's ultimately cleaved to C3d. So if C3d is present, you absolutely have had complement activation and generation of C3a, an inflammatory mediator. So on the right-hand side, as you can see, we not only use an anti-human IgG 1 through 4 to detect the human antibody, we add a second conjugate that's anti-C3d, and it picks up that little C4 fragment, that little flag. So now we generate two signals for every antibody bound or immune complex bound, whereas the other test only generates one. So what that does in a nutshell is it improves the sensitivity, and it's also highly specific. So it also improves this, the specificity as well.
So Brent, is it also fair to say that when you look at kind of some of the IgG tests, they're really measuring the part of your immune system which is measuring exposure to a food, which is kind of interesting, but a bit of a so what? And so, the kind of smarts that you really came up with was adding that inflammatory pathway. So you're looking at not only the part of the immune system which is measuring exposure, which, as I say, is the so what, it's then the smarts that you added, which was saying, let's measure the part of the immune system which is only triggered by an inflammatory pathway. And as you see in that diagram, when you combine those two together, it enables us to really zero in on those key foods and, in essence, eliminate the false positives, which have been very, I guess, famous or well known, for better or worse, for the IgG testing that I think Dr. Thomas was alluding to earlier in terms of some of his dissatisfaction.
So yeah, so I find this very interesting. So the anti-C3d is the secret sauce, and clearly the complement system has been activated. So you're getting a definite reaction to, in this case, a food antigen. So I would assume that's pretty hard to measure. Are there other things where you're measuring anti-C3d through like a blood spot test for other kind of things?
Well, you could. I mean, as long as immune complexes were there and they've activated the C3, it's covalently linked. So once it's there permanently. So you may be able to measure it in a dried blood spot or under, with a different sample. Right now, we're using either serum, whole blood, or the dried blood spot. So we can elute that and measure it. And there may be other sample types that you could use as well, maybe CSF if you had to, or something like that.
So are there other areas in medicine where we're measuring C3d?
Yes, C3d is very important in graft versus host reaction. So in tissue transplantation. So what they do there is, I worked in renal medicine for quite a while, and what they did is they say, oh yeah, we put in a bean, and what they meant is they put in a kidney, and then what they would do is they would biopsy that periodically, and especially if the patient was having some rejection episode, and what they would do is do immunofluorescence, and they would look at an anti-C3d antibody. If that was positive, that indicated you had graft versus host reaction, and the patient was rejecting that kidney. So that's one area that it's quite useful. And they also measure it, can measure it for other types of transplants as well. And you can do in some sort of, sometimes blood sorts of reactions as well. If you, there's a disease called paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria. There you go. I actually spit that out. You can measure it in that sort of scenario. If you have a deletion of a factor called decay accelerating factor, if that's not present, that's a genetic problem. And if you get deposition of C3D, of course you get activation of complement. So it could potentially, or it is used in that scenario as well. So, and I imagine there are more as well.
Yeah,
I just want to say one thing real quick.
In medical school, I was convinced this young girl had this paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria.
There you go.
So I was trying to convince everybody we needed to pursue this. So I was putting little cups of urine in the windowsill as they peed through the night so they could see this shocking difference.
Yeah.
And finally, there's like, okay, you're right. We got to pursue this, and we got to get the urine out of the windowsill.
Yeah, I've seen that once or twice, and it's shocking. Indeed, if if the patient isn't shocked, the doctor will be.
Well, so I just want to share. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Bill.
No, what I was going to say is you're talking about this in the conventional side of it, and James is bringing it up. It measures just exposure, and with the test that I had done, and I think Cliff was saying he had the same results. When I did my test, the one that I've done before, it was all the foods that I'd been typically eating. It was like the almonds and the eggs, and a lot of the foods that I'd just been eating a lot of. So that makes sense that this measures just exposure. But then, how did we know that was really triggering inflammation?
Right, and I guess so. What the one arm of the immune system is the adaptive. That will measure exposure by virtue of the fact that you produce antibodies. And then the innate, of course, is the complement system. And that is something that's triggered by a variety of things. One of them is immune complexes. So that's the innate. So this will measure not only the adaptive, but also the innate immune system.
Gotcha. Good explanation.
So again, just a brief history. So we founded the company in 2004, and our goal right from the get-go was to produce a test that was highly reliable. When we looked at the number of tests out there, and there was still quite a few in 2004, there weren't standards, there weren't controls. I mean, you could flip a coin, and I mean, it was a coin toss as to whether you were really positive or not. So the reproducibility was very, very poor. So I said, I think there's room in this space for a very good test. So we leased a 20,000 square foot facility. As I mentioned, we're ISO 13485 certified, FDA registered. And Tony Recupero runs the CLIA high complexity lab where the FIT test is actually performed. A very, very nice facility, well managed. We got our patent finally granted in 2012. It was a bit of a battle with the patent office, but persistence definitely won the day there. Not to mention a pile of money. The owner of the cell line is KBMO, so that's good. So we realized right away we needed to license this cell, and James worked on that very hard, and we licensed that in. And we're the first company to get COPROFIS and MVisa certification for other countries. So that's a very prestigious and very hard to get certifications. Next slide. So what we do is we test a number of categories of foods. A little bit hard for me to read that, but suffice to say we test, dairy, eggs, meat, fruits, microbial types of things, vegetables, and a host of other things. And they're common foods that are in mostly the American diet. Now we've expanded with 176. So we've added one more panel which has just been released within the past week. And we're trying to expand it into different categories with different foods as well. But it's pretty comprehensive and covers most of the real popular items in the diet.
So I have a question on that. So food's complex, any food's complex. There's a lot of things going on in it. So what do you get from the food that you expose to the ELISA variation CB3, the C3D? So what do you get from the food? How do you isolate something from the food and know that it's testing that food?
Okay, so what we do is we, first of all, these are GMO foods. There's no pesticides. So, and bacterially, there's no bacterial products in there. So what we do then is we have a food that we extract proteins from using our proprietary process. So we actually extract each individual food, and then we coat it onto a 96-well ELISA plate. So that we bind the antigen. So those red spots that you saw when the ELISA was depicted, those are food antigens from all of these categories that are on the ELISA plate. And they're bound there permanently. And then we coat and stabilize it with blocking agents, etc. And so when you send a sample to us, whether it's a blood spot or serum sample or something like that, what we'll do is we'll either extract the antibodies or immune complexes, or we'll get them right out of the serum. We add that to the plate. So the antibodies and immune complexes that are in your serum or in your whole blood then bind to those food antigens that have been extracted for each individual food on the plate. And in parallel, what we do is we run a blank, so a blank and a three-point standard curve, so that we can get some sense of are the reagents in the test performing up to specifications. So that's something that we included in here along with the food antigens.
So every test has a control group.
Yes, it does. Every single plate has a control, and it has specifications. And if the plate is run and it doesn't meet specifications, it's rejected and repeated. So we know how the reagents work and how the plate's performing for every single sample we run. So that's pretty prestigious, because a lot of these other tests, there'll be 96 wells on a plate. They'll run 95 foods in a blank control, and that's it. I love it. It's, as I say in science, it's an N of 1. You can't go wrong. They just report the results as they report them, and they have no idea whether the plate's really performed or it hasn't.
Right. I like it.
So in the next slide, so this is just a typical report. And when we designed this report, we wanted it to be simple and intuitive. And when either a doctor or a patient looked at it, we wanted within 10 seconds for that person to know what they're sensitive to or not, without having to go through all these numbers and other reports that we've looked at. They give you numbers, they make your head spin. You can't figure out what these numbers even mean. So what we did is we take the numbers and we run them through a proprietary report, sum of squares, and that picks out each individual food that's positive when you compare it against the whole array. And so as you can see here, the red is 4+, and then you've got yellow and some lower ones that we'll discuss later on. And then what's blown up right there is just the additives. We test for a lot of food additives, which cause a lot of problems in people. So that's just highlighted as one category.
Yeah, and the other reason is generally because you're seeing a lot of patients eating too much processed food. So let's kind of capture those colorings and additives just to show you that, have that conversation with them.
Yes. Good point there. Yes. So in the next slide, again, what this depicts is just the 3 panels, A, B, and C, and it shows you all the various categories of foods that are tested, and that some are positive and some aren't. So the green aren't positive, and then red, tan, and yellow are. And you've got some aqua ones there that are 2+, and those are right at the borderline. So we don't really pay too much attention to those. We mostly focus on the 4, 3, and 2+, the red, the yellow, and the tan. And
Brent, I'm curious, out of all the tests you guys have done, how many people, what percentage has turned out to be gluten sensitive or wheat sensitive?
so we get a group of patients, obviously they're not feeling well. So given that we've got that group, within that group, we get probably, I would say, around 30%. We have gluten, wheat, or some combination thereof of that particular sensitivity. It varies a little bit over time. Some, if you analyze 1,000 patients, it may be 30% in that cohort. The next time you may look at it, it may be 40%, but it hovers right in that particular category. And I think that kind of, from talking to the doctors, and maybe you can share your experience, that fits well with a lot of the problems that people are having. Gluten does seem to be the poster child for a lot of problems for various people, causing all kinds of things.
Well, I've been searching for it for 25 years, and I really thought it was much higher than that. So that was interesting numbers. Yeah. Probably the closest to any kind of verification that I've gotten anywhere on what the percentage or rate is. So that's interesting. Another one is, for me, I was on level 3, I guess that's yellow, with yeast. And certainly a lot of the gluten comes with a lot of yeast.
Yes.
And interesting for me, I realize that I really react to beer. My ankles will swell up pretty quickly, and some beer a lot more than others. So I, essentially don't drink beer. I like beer though. But I think it's the yeast that was probably bothering me.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's part of the problem when you as a physician, you've got a patient presenting with a variety of symptoms, and you say, oh, you test positive for gluten, and you also test positive for yeast. So is it the gluten? Is it the yeast? Is it both? So very often some of these sensitivities, you'll see they'll be one will kind of follow the other almost. So it's a question of what is the patient most sensitive to, or is it both in that particular case? But yeast is a particular problem for people as well.
Yeah, so I don't know if anybody's made the connection in anything I've ever read between the yeast and the gluten. So that's interesting. Thanks.
No, but you're right. I mean, in breads and things like that, obviously you have gluten, and you're going to have yeast and yeast byproducts in there. So, and beer for sure, it's the same thing. So yeah, it does make a lot of sense. So in the next slide. So what we do is, along with the test results, we provide the meal plan. So this will take a look at what you're sensitive to, and then this will give you a rotation diet on a daily basis and some suggestions so that you'll get nutritional meal, and you can also make some substitutions so that you can avoid the sensitive food. So that's that is included with the price when you purchase the fit test.
And I just want to say I appreciated that too with my test, because like if you take eggs away from me, I'm like, oh crap, what am I going to do? So yeah. Having this here to follow this guideline was really handy.
Well, I actually liked it because you guys, I think, did a good job of picking some pretty tasty foods. And it's a nice little brief meal plan that's pretty decent.
Yeah, it helps. It definitely helps people. For sure.
Yeah, and the idea is, to your point, is giving them some hope. So to your point, generally, if you're given all these foods you're not meant to eat, then the bottom lip starts quivering and the patient gets a bit grumpy about it. Whereas if you can say, good news is, here's a shorter group you have to avoid, and more importantly, here's some suggestions of what you can eat, they generally leave feeling somewhat positive versus the initial response of what can I not eat. So I think the idea is that it helps give them a packaged idea versus just the bad news. The idea is give them some good news as well.
Right.
So and what will accompany the test as well is the phone app, and this is really, really clever, because now patient can download the app. They've got it on their phone, and everybody has a phone. Lord knows that. And then if they go out to eat, they could, and they have a question about the menu at a restaurant, or they're out shopping at the supermarket, they can use it as a very handy, quick guide to make sure that they don't get foods that have components in them that they're supposed to exclude from the diet. And I think we all know the fine print on some of these boxes. You look down there and they've got everything in under the sun in these processed foods. And as James mentioned, BHA, BHT, red 3, yellow 6, you name it, they put it in these processed foods. And if you happen to be sensitive to some of those things, you've got a quick reference to make sure that you don't have foods with those sorts of ingredients in them. So it's a very, very nice feature.
So, Brent, my test came out pretty good. I was able to eat most foods without a problem, but the highest reaction was quinoa. Well, that's not so bad because I don't eat a lot of quinoa, but if you go down the gluten-free aisle, which I'm not a big fan of, huge amount of that has quinoa in it.
Mm-hmm. Well, quinoa, again, it's one that we just added to the new panel because we know that is a popular substitute and people are switching to that. But I guess the jury's still out. I don't know really what to expect with quinoa, and we'll have to look at the percent positive over time with that. But it's a little surprising that you'd be sensitive to quinoa.
I was surprised as well.
Yeah.
So back to validation. So I do the test 3 months from now and say I don't eat any quinoa. Will it show up still red in quinoa?
It probably will not. In general, and we've got a nice study that we did. We'll show you that in the upcoming slides. But what happens is antibody, once you stop being exposed to an antigen, or in this case, a food antigen, what we say is to go 6 to 8 weeks, roughly, because every 2 weeks, about half the amount of antibody is lost. So if you had, in the first week, if you had 10, let's just say 10 milligrams per mil, whatever it is, in 2 weeks, you'll have 5. In the next 2 weeks, you'll have 2.5. In the next 2 weeks, you'll have 1.5. And then the fourth one go round, you'll be well below 1 mg per mil. Now, that's when antibodies read the textbook and everything goes perfectly. But you can follow that general scheme. There's some time course where these antibodies go down pretty quickly, and within 2 months, they're down at a pretty low level. And indeed, we've shown that with the patients, but they've gone out about 10 or 11 months, and we'll show you that data soon.
So on one respect, when a patient's really symptomatic would be a really good time to do this because they may show in the red on quite a few things. But then if they avoid that, they may get better pretty quickly and may be able to sporadically eat that kind of food down the line, provided that they're feeling better and kind of healed. Yes,
and that's exactly correct. So you'd find out right away when they're symptomatic, they have high antibody, high immune complexes, a lot of symptoms. They stop eating it, generally get better pretty quickly, and very often you can eat little bits of or small amounts of it infrequently, and you'll be okay. Now, having said that, there are some disease states like celiac and other irritable bowel syndromes where you never want to eat this food, especially wheat or something like that again. But in most people, I think you can eat it sporadically, but just don't eat a lot of it and eat it frequently, and I think you'll be okay. Next slide. So the new products, so we have the new Fit 132 and we have the Fit 176 now. So that's a whole new panel. We're quite excited about that. A very, very nice test just came out last week. Of course, we have the COVID-19 antibody test. That's still chugging along. James is doing the spade work trying to get this finally approved by FDA. He's very close. He can probably speak to that better than I can, but we're still using it in the lab, and there's still plenty of call for that. Zonulin test, we're expecting some exciting results, hopefully in about 2 or 3 weeks. We used a new method to produce an antibody that's specific in zonulin, and we're hoping to get some good results from that, and we should know within a couple of weeks. And of course, as James mentioned, the FAST test, we're getting good data on that. What we're doing now is just trying to perfect the processes, the antigens, and manufacturing so that this can finally be released, and that will measure in about 5 minutes. It will measure antibodies and immune complexes against wheat, egg, and milk. So 3 real big ones. And then what we figure is later on, we can put another panel in there. So maybe there'll be a fast test family where this is the first one out, and then we can add other foods as we go along.
Just real quick, on the zonulin test,
Yes.
Can we explain what that is? I don't know if everybody knows what that is.
We'll go through that in one of the subsequent slides. So
okay.
We'll cover that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So the new Fit 132, as you can see, we removed some safflower, cottonseed, squash, cola, and catfish, and we added butternut, sea bass, quinoa, lamb, and whey. So that's the new Fit 132, and as I mentioned, the 176 is out as well.
Next slide.
Slide. So this just highlights some of the new foods for the 176. So like people are finding that sheep's milk, it's a lot more tolerable for some people than cow's milk. So it's a natural, if you like milk and you like cheese and that sort of thing, sheep's milk and sheep-based cheese is a good alternative for a lot of people. And we've added some new grains. Again, people's diets have changed a little bit, especially over the last decade. So amaranth and buckwheat and sorghum and spelt, which is a type of wheat, have been added just to reflect the change in diet. And then, as you can see, we've added some other things as well. Shellfish, oysters, one of my favorites, and squid as well. So it's, as I say, it's an expanded panel, and I think it hits the high notes for some of the foods that people have been putting in their diet over the past 10 years.
And certainly some of the feedback we've been getting from the providers who've been using it have loved it, because they've said, look, these are a lot of the foods we're considering putting patients on to eat now, that they might have been, eating processed foods. We thought, well, let's put them on, more kale, Brussels sprouts, those kind of things. So they're excited the fact that we're now measuring that before they put them on those foods. So the idea is that expanded panel kind of helps kind of try and almost pre-guess what are the foods that those patients are going to be maybe sensitive to. So rather than put them onto a whole new diet and then find that they're no better, let's test them up front before they're put on some of these. I would say maybe under kind of Dr. Google, the kind of superfoods, but they're the ones that lots of people are now talking about putting them on. So that's, I think, where this additional 44 foods is proven to be pretty popular with a lot of the providers.
Brent, a quick question. Say you're IgE allergic to something like peanuts, and you did this test in peanuts, it would still show up as a complement activation, I assume.
It can. I mean, in that case, you're measuring IgE. But what we're finding, and that's a really interesting point, is you have a lot of times people have allergies. And I review a lot of reports, and I don't know what they have because I haven't done a patient history. But what I can tell you is you'll come up with things like peanuts, different types of fruits, different types of berries, and they'll all be sensitive to quite a few things, nuts. And when you look at it together, what they have, when you look at the patient history, is they have seasonal allergies, and mostly against pollen. And so the tie-in is a lot of these foods have antigens that cause pollen allergies, especially like birch. It's called BET-V1. But the common thing is that all these fruits have homologs of those proteins, and these allergic people seem to have a lot of foods in those categories that they're sensitive to when you look at the food sensitivity. You can almost guess this person has allergies just from looking at the profile and not even knowing that in advance.
Interesting.
Yeah. So in the next slide, so overview of zonulin. So it's a protein that's synthesized in the intestine and liver cells. It's a key biomarker for intestinal permeability through the work of Alessandro Fasano, who is now at Mass General Hospital. It's a reversible regulator of intestinal permeability, and elevated levels of zonulin absolutely indicate leaky gut, but it's associated with autoimmune, glucose intolerance, celiac, asthma. You can just go on and on. Type 1 diabetes, multiple sclerosis, and probably many other diseases as well. But if you have a high zonulin level, you by definition have leaky gut. The nice thing of it is that once you stop, if you identify the foods, let's say, that are causing inflammation, you stop eating them, you reduce inflammation, the zonulin levels will go down. So the gut will heal itself, and the FIT test will give you a good roadmap to help the physician, to help the patient get better. So the good news is the gut will heal itself over time, but it's associated, zonulin itself, high zonulin is associated with many, many diverse diseases. So we've been looking to launch this for quite some time. There's been a couple of bumps in the road, but what we want to do is we're going to measure zonulin protein and not antibodies and not properdin. The current test that's out there is a good test, but zonulin has a small sequence in it that cross-reacts with properdin. When they made the test, they didn't know that. And so they started picking up properdin, which is actually a complement system stabilizer for the alternative pathway. So these zonulin tests measure both zonulin and properdin. But talking to Dr. Fasano, who really, he's an MD, he's a worldwide expert, he says that zonulin antibodies are really not of clinical utility. You really have to measure the protein. So based on that, we are looking to develop a test that measures zonulin in both blood spot, so dried blood spot, as well as serum. Again, Dr. Fasano, he's the discoverer of zonulin, and we're partnering with him to help us develop as well as test this test, you know, in his laboratory once it's done. What he has is a library of samples that nobody else in the world has. So once we get this test developed, he can run a panel and validate it for us. And that was just myself. I was involved in rapid HIV diagnostics back in the 90s, and that was a rapid diagnostic test. So
just going back to the last slide, just to kind of mention, we're now, as we launch that test, we're going to be adding zonulin to each of the 3 panels. So the FIT22, the 132, and the 176. So again, as Brent's been talking about, we're looking at food sensitivities, we're looking at inflammation via the complement activation. And then when we look at leaky gut, we're getting at that 3 ways. We're looking at that if you've got more than 10 foods elevated, that can be indicative of it. If you've got elevated candida, Brent always calls that the canary in the coal mine. And now on top of that, we'll have the zonulin as well. And so as we're developing it, the idea is to put that on each of the panels. So we're giving you those 3 different areas. Because as I say, fundamentally, when you run these tests, you're trying to heal the gut. So let's try and give you some more evidence or information around how do we get to heal that gut by looking at the zonulin as well as the candida and the more than 10 foods elevated.
I like it.
Yeah. So the next slide. So this just shows the FAST device, the rapid test. So it's just a finger stick. You use 1 drop of blood. You add the reagent to the wells, and you get spots on the device in about 5 minutes. And they correspond to, as I mentioned, wheat, milk, and egg. So if you're sensitive to one or all of those things, a spot will appear at that location. And plus, as you can see, we have a control on this device. And if the control doesn't appear, obviously the test was done incorrectly. So you'll get the control in at least 1 other spot, or maybe up to 4 in all. But it's kind of a nifty test, and it's based on the same concept as the HIV test that I developed a few years ago. So it's quick, it's simple, it'll be cheap, and it's virtually a food test that's like a pregnancy test almost. That simple and bulletproof.
Yeah, I think that's going to be phenomenal. Be able to, right while you're talking to a patient, say, "Here, let's do this right now."
Yeah.
And I think the idea was, as you say, if you can screen for the big 3, as we call them, then that gives you an ability then to reflex them onto the larger panels, and it gives you some evidence whilst you're right there and then, versus saying, "Hang on, we think we've got it, but it's going to be 7 to 10 days before we hear back from the lab." So the idea is at least give you some of that information up front, which I think hopefully will be very helpful in terms of, to your point, Dr. Thomas, in terms of getting the patient engaged and recognizing that it's a problem right now.
Now the wheat, is that also gluten? When you say wheat, is that gluten as well? Okay.
Yes. Yeah. That was whole wheat that's been extracted, so it has gluten and gliadin.
Gotcha.
So I guess we can just draw a few conclusions over what we've shown you. It's multi-pathway detection, so the adaptive as well as the innate. It's a best-in-class patient compliance tools, as you saw, easy to understand report. You have a diet plan, meal plan that goes with it, and you have a great app that's a quick reference when you need it. The clinical outcomes are excellent, and they are backed by a IRB-approved clinical study and new products developed by a world-class science and physicians. So we've got a very, very good group of people at the company, and they're all working hard on developing these new products and product systems.
Very good, guys. It looks good. I'm hopeful this is going to make a difference.
Well, I think you will, yeah.
Quick question. What would you advise somebody for doing a test? Obviously, you do it the initial time. Do you have like a rule of thumb on when you'd want to come back and retest again?
Well, go ahead, James.
Yeah, I mean, generally 6 to 8 months after you've done the first test, because again, if you think about it, you've eliminated those foods as you look to reintroduce them. If you think about it, it's that 72-hour delay. So you try the food, you see if the symptoms return. If not, move on to the next food. So generally, it's a kind of 6 to 8 month process once you've eliminated, as Brent was talking about, kind of 2 or 3 months up front, and then looking to start reintroducing if your symptoms have improved. So it's in that kind of time scale. And again, with the zonulin, the idea of adding that to the panel, that it'll be a good way of of trying to baseline patients by running that up front. And then because, as Brent was pointing out, that it's a reversible protein, the idea is if that was elevated because it's now part of the protein and you're seeing closer links to clinical symptoms, that as that patient improves, that when you look to do that retest with the zonulin on board now, then what you'll see is that hopefully you'll have a good way of measuring that those clinical symptoms are being reflected by hopefully a lower value in your zonulin levels as well as Brent and Dr. Thomas were talking about. If you eliminate that food, you should see it move from a red to a green. If you've seen that removed as well.
Okay, that makes sense. So we talked. Well, Dr. Thomas, you got anything else, or is that?
Not right now.
Okay.
I think it looks great.
Yeah. So we talked before this. We're rolling this product here out at Human, and James was very kind to give us $50 off. So we're going to be passing that savings down to the client here. So if it's something that you're interested, you can get with us. Give us a call and call or email us, whatever works best for you. We can talk about the different pricing on the associated tests. But I mean, I loved your description, Brent, just like how this is a roadmap. Like, you know, when somebody's looking at health, they're trying a million different things. And this is probably one of the best places where you could start, you know, really getting your diet nailed. And sometimes, you know, a diet just doesn't mean eating whole foods. It means, you know, eating the right foods per you. And we're all individually designed differently, you know, so making sure you're matching the foods to yourself. This is a huge, I think, game changer in finding that, you know, optimal health for yourself and getting out of a rut that you might be in.
No, I agree. I mean, you know, foods are the biggest exposure your body has to almost anything. So if you can learn what you're sensitive to so that you can avoid causing inflammation, basically, you're going to feel better. Now, some people, it's enormous. I mean, it's a life changer. Other people, not quite so dramatic. But the bottom line is you identify foods that you're sensitive to, you definitely will feel better, and it gives you the information and as you said, a roadmap to do that.
Right. Well, I thank you guys for this time. I mean, I really appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to our relationship as we go forward and just seeing how we can help as many people as possible.
Likewise. Great. Well, thanks very much for your time, both of you.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye-bye.